Hello, everyone. Hello. I am so excited to welcome you today to Alta Live, joining today's discussion on the possibility of reintroducing the grizzly bear to California. Believe it or not, for those that don't know, the grizzly bear hasn't been roaming free and wild in California for nearly 100 years. So we're going to talk about that today and whether or not they can and should and will come back. Today's guest is Professor Peter Alagona, and he's an associate professor of environmental studies at UC Santa Barbara. After earning his PhD at UCLA, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard and Stanford universities. Since moving to Santa Barbara, he has received several awards, including the National Science Foundation Career Grant and the Harold J. Plough Award given to the UC Santa Barbara College of Letters and Sciences Most Outstanding Junior Faculty Member. I've been chatting with him for 5 minutes and I want to take his class. I'm an elderly lady. He is the author of more than 3 dozen publications in the areas of environmental history, geography, philosophy, and policy, including, and perhaps most relevant to today's conversation, After the Grizzly, Endangered Species and the Politics of Place in California. Before we dive in to our conversation with Pete, some brief housekeeping. Alta Live is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. In fact, today's discussion was inspired by and is an expansion on an article by Alta's associate editor, AJ Orona. It's called The Grizzly Next Door, and you can read it in our issue. If you're unfamiliar with our magazine, we're an award-winning quarterly focused on California and the West. You can join us as a member for as little as $3 a month and support the work we do, including weekly events like this, a monthly California book club. In fact, tomorrow we'll welcome poet Claudia Rankine. And all of these events are free, but you can support us joining as a member for as little as $3 a month, or right now we're running a special. For $50, you get a year of Alta, a cool hat, and our new book. We made a book, our guide to the best indie bookstores of California and the West. So please do consider. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions for Pete. We will chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. This interview will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com later today. Send you an email with a link to the video, AJ's fascinating article, and anything else that pops up. It's so great to be here with our community today. I see Sacramento, LA, Fresno, Pasadena, Azusa in the house, San Joaquin Valley, Claremont. Please do let us know where you're zooming in from. I am in Novato, California. Pete, Professor Pete, welcome. Where are you today?
I'm at home here in Santa Barbara, where I teach at UCSB.
Very cool. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time away from bringing the grizzly bears back to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Beth, and a big thank you and shout out to AJ Orona, who wrote this article and who I got to get out into the field with. I see that you're there in the chat, so welcome, AJ, and thank you so much.
Hi, AJ. AJ is fantastic and has helped me prep my questions, so they'll be super smart. But my first is really, before we get to the future of grizzlies in California, we know them so well. In fact, as you pointed out, I've got one. The logo of the California Book Club is a grizzly bear. It is on the California state flag. It is one of our state mascots, if not the state mascot. Can you tell us the history of the grizzly bear in California and the present, such as it is?
Yeah, sure. So the history of the grizzly bear in California is actually, at least in evolutionary and geologic time, a relatively short one, a recent one. According to our group's research, and we'll talk about a bunch of our findings, I'm sure, over the next few minutes here, grizzlies actually didn't arrive in California until very late in this region's ecological history. Black bears have probably been in California on and off for almost 1 million years. Grizzly bears only arrived in the northern part of the state maybe 35,000 years ago and didn't make it to the southern portion of California into maybe as late as 8,000 or 10,000 years ago. So that is like a blink. It might sound like a long time to folks listening, but that is a blink of geologic and evolutionary time. They, in a sense, arrived after a lot of the Pleistocene megafauna, the giant short-faced bears and dire wolves and saber-toothed cats disappeared from the landscape, and they probably filled some of those vacant niches. Over the next many thousands of years, they established really rich and complex relationships with indigenous people throughout California. Many tribes in California regard bears as their literal kin and as somewhere between something like human and natural, or somewhere between the realms of nature and culture. So bears occupy an intermediate space that is, in a sense, in many belief systems, partly human. By the time of the gold rush in California, there were probably about something like 10,000 grizzly bears in the state. That number may actually have increased a bit over the previous century or so, in part as the result of the introduction of European livestock to California, which then proliferated across the range. Cows and sheep and goats were dying out on the range all over the place. And we see the traces of that in the nutrition that all kinds of animals were eating at that time, including grizzly bears, but also condors, coyotes, wolves, and others. So on the eve of the gold rush, like I said, 10,000 bears. What does that mean? Well, at that time, there were probably only about 110,000 people in California. The population of the state had crashed from about 350,000 likely to about 110,000. And so that means that in 1849, there were something like one grizzly for every 11 people in California, which is kind of mind-boggling. The ratio now is about 40 million to 0. Back then, it was about 1 to 11. So grizzlies were doing pretty well at that point, but things turned bad for them real quick. Over the next 75 years, they declined precipitously as a result of persecution, hunting, trapping, poisoning on the range. And the last credible sighting of a grizzly in California occurred in 1924 in the Southern Sierra. So that's almost exactly a century ago. And since then, they've been our mascot of the state, but they've been missing from California. They do still live in other parts of the lower 48 US states and other parts of the world. We can talk more about that as well. But this topic had kind of gone dark for a long time until my colleagues and I kind of picked it up about maybe 7 or 8 years ago and started doing research on it that's led us to this point where we've really been able to learn a tremendous amount about grizzly bears in California that wasn't known before. And in a sense, we're kind of trying to rewrite this kind of long dead history.
What prompted you, of all of the things that you could decide to work on? I know that the California condor has been restored, as AJ pointed out in his article. That bird was gone for 5 years, whereas the grizzly bear has been gone for 100. Of all of the things you could work on, what made you say, wait, let's bring back the grizzly bear?
So I actually didn't. And to the extent that I have now, years later, it is in a sense reluctantly and based on evidence. And so here's kind of the way it happened. I finished my first book in 2013, and at that point, this topic really hadn't been brought up in a long time. It wasn't really an issue, but a number of things happened around 2014 that kind of changed that and made me think that this was time, after many decades, to actually revisit this story in a new way. And so I could list a bunch of things that happened around that time, but I'll just tell you a couple. One is that it had become apparent by then that black bear populations throughout the US, and particularly in California, had been booming for many decades. The black bear population in California has probably at least tripled since 1980, maybe quadrupled. So there's that. Wolves had just shown up back in California for the first time in about 75 years in 2011. So that was a big deal. There was increasing signs that people were more interested in and potentially tolerant of living with large carnivores on the landscape and understanding their crucial ecological roles. And so in some ways, the animal that most embodies that is P22, the famous mountain lion of Los Angeles that passed away just a few months ago.
Also in this issue, we talk about.
That's right. Yeah. And then another thing that had been happening was, maybe two more. One is that efforts to recover grizzly bears in the northern Rockies had been seeing some success for the first time in a long time. The population of grizzlies in the lower 48 US states in 1800 was probably about 50,000. It probably declined to less than or fewer than 1,000 by 1975. Now it's back up to something like 2,000. So it's roughly doubled since 1975, but it's still only about 5% of what it once was. But the doubling is an important thing. That's a good trend. And then the final thing I think that folks may not be aware of, but is absolutely fascinating, is Europe. In Europe, the four large carnivores that inhabit the European continent, the terrestrial carnivores, wolves, wolverine, lynx, and brown bears. Brown bears are the same species as what we call grizzlies here in California. All have been increasing their populations and expanding their ranges. Europe is the continent with the most densely populated human population, obviously, and the fewest natural areas. And that kind of shows that under the right circumstances, people can coexist with these animals. And so all of these things were happening around the same time. And so by 2016, my colleagues and I kind of thought, wow, now is maybe the time to revisit this California grizzly story and think about what this broader context might mean for how we think about both the past of that story and maybe its future here in California. So we did not start out saying it's a good idea to bring back the grizzly. We started out by saying now is a good time to revisit this fascinating story.
Okay, I have like 800 questions about this, mainly because, what the topic of the story is reintroducing the grizzly that hasn't roamed here. And there was only one in 1914. It's not like there were 10,000, there was one scraggler hanging on. What happened to him, by the way? Do you know what happened to the last, or 1924? What happened to the last grizzly?
Yeah, so the final sightings of many species are sort of shrouded in a bit of mystery unless we have physical evidence. The last credible kill of a California grizzly happened in 1922 in the Southern Sierra. And then 2 years later, there was a sighting that was documented by a number of people, including a road crew that was working in the vicinity of just on the western edge of Sequoia National Park. And the animal that they described seeing had all the typical traits that you would expect of a grizzly bear and not a black bear. And so although we don't have clear physical evidence, we don't know 100% that that animal that was seen by that group of folks on that day in 1924 was a grizzly. That is generally considered the last credible sighting of a grizzly bear in California. By that time, their populations had obviously disappeared from the coastlines and the coastal valleys and the foothills. And at that point, they were much more relegated to the more remote areas of the state, including places like the Southern Sierra. It's worth saying that, although many people associate grizzly bears today with high mountain areas like Yellowstone or Glacier National Park, that is really an artifact that's ahistorical, and it's an artifact of what we've done to them. Grizzly bears occurred very widely in a wide variety of different habitats. It's just that those are the areas in which they remain, the places to which we have relegated them. In California, the largest populations of grizzlies were probably in some of the places that people also liked the most and had the largest and most prosperous indigenous communities along the coastline from San Diego all the way up into Sonoma. And there were some key resources there that both people and grizzlies relied on, like acorns, for example, and a variety of other plants in the chaparral ecosystem. And so, the fact that the last grizzly was seen in the Sierra doesn't mean that that's where they mostly lived. It means that that was the area to which they had been confined by the early 1900s.
So grizzlies now exist. There are, you said, approximately 2,000 grizzlies, wild grizzlies, roaming Wyoming, Alaska, various states, not California. Why bring them back to California?
Yeah. So a couple things.
People, we're packed. Yeah. We don't have enough houses for us.
Right. So I would argue that those are two different issues, but let's take a step back. So the 2,000 number applies to the contiguous 48 states. In Alaska, there are probably closer to about 40,000 brown bears. Not all of them are considered grizzlies. There are a couple different kinds of brown bears in that area, and there are a number of different kinds of brown bears that are broadly considered subspecies that occur throughout Western North America, Europe, and Asia. The total number of brown bears worldwide is about 200,000, which makes them a IUCN species of least concern, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, species of least concern, but their range and probably their numbers have been roughly cut in half over the last couple hundred years. So there's still a lot, but there used to be a lot more. Now, you cut right to the hardest question. It is much easier to answer questions about, what did they eat? Where did they live? Where could they come back? Than the question of why should they come back? That is not a scientific question. That's a question about people's attitudes and values and worldviews. But what we're mainly focused on is the question of could they? The purpose of doing that is to introduce this to a broader public and allow a kind of democratic process of conversation about this to go forward based on evidence, not just based on feelings or people's fear or what movie they saw. I saw Grizzly Man, a few weeks ago, and now I'm scared. This is kind of an evidence-based thing. And so what our research is showing is that even in a state like California with 40 million people, our ecosystems could support grizzlies. Grizzlies could live here. They would probably benefit our ecosystems in a number of ways. The question is, do people want them back, and are we willing to make the sacrifices, make the accommodations that would be required to coexist with them? Let me say one thing. In Europe, brown bears exist in Italy, which is a country that is smaller than California by land area, has a much larger population and no significant national parks. They exist in Greece. There are large numbers of them in Romania and Bulgaria and Slovenia and Spain. There are large numbers in Finland. They're all over the place, right? It's not always easy, but the fact that they are there suggests that having them around is a choice. By assuming that it's impossible, that's making a choice, right? And so what we're doing is we're showing that it's not impossible and opening up a new kind of conversation.
Okay.
Now you did ask why. I can give you an answer for me.
Okay. But
only for me.
Sure.
Okay? I didn't think that this was necessarily the right thing to do when I got started with this. I was interested more from an academic perspective. But as this process went on and it became clear that this was possible, then you get faced with this question of why, right? And so for me, there are a couple reasons. One of the reasons is ecological, right? That there are potential benefits of having these animals on the landscape, like there are a lot of other large-bodied animals, including especially carnivores. That's one thing, but that's to me actually less significant than some other things. But it's something people ask a lot about. Another one is an ethical question of, was this right to remove these animals from a place where they could have lived at that time? Keep in mind that grizzlies did not disappear from California because their habitat disappeared. There's still plenty of habitat out there. They disappeared because a small group of white English-speaking men armed with guns, traps, and poisons took it upon themselves to kill them all off at a time just a few decades before laws were passed that would have prevented it. Mm. That's one thing. Two, or three now, I think three, these animals are intimately tied to indigenous cultures, languages, relations with the land throughout California. People who are leading wildlife conservation efforts through tribes in California will evaluate this and come to their own conclusions, and I would never want to speak for them. But opening up this conversation, I think, is an important thing as part of a larger recognition that what happened in California with indigenous people and grizzlies is essentially the same exact process that happened with indigenous people and bison on the Great Plains. There was a concerted effort to remove indigenous people, in part by removing the animals that they were most associated with. Hard to wrap our minds around that today, but it happened. Finally, one more thing. Being out on the landscape with large carnivores like bears, I have an 11-year-old child. I don't want to put anybody at risk. Risk is actually very, very low. We can talk about that. But living in a place, like if you live around Yellowstone, for example, and you know that these animals are out there, it really changes the way that you understand and see the place. It makes you more aware of things. It allows you to see nature in new ways. It encourages you to share your experience with others, maybe because you don't want to be so alone in the woods, right? There are a lot of advantages of living in a landscape that has these animals on it that it's very hard for us to understand when we don't.
Okay. Can you tell me, those are fantastic reasons. What's the guy or gal or person who is opposed to reintroducing the grizzly bear to California going to say? What's
Yeah.
their argument?
So one of the first studies that our group published when we got started in 2016, it actually came out in 2019, was a public opinion survey where we tried to figure out what people knew about grizzlies in California and what they thought about them. And the results of that study were really interesting. First of all, only about 1 in 4 Californians know that grizzlies are extinct in the state. So there are about 30 million people in California who don't know the first thing about this story, which is why the kind of work that we're doing here and that AJ did in this article is so important. So that's something. I think another important insight from that study was that in a low knowledge environment like that, most people haven't really developed strong opinions about this yet. So whereas there's quite a bit of conflict in places like Montana right now, in areas where brown bears are coming back, grizzlies are coming back, that doesn't really exist here yet because it hasn't been really part of the political conversation yet. What I would anticipate is that as this starts to emerge and filter into the broader consciousness, there will be an emotional reaction from some folks who fear this, one. And two, there will be a reaction among some people, particularly people who live in certain communities that are near potential reintroduction sites, who say, this is maybe an example of bringing something to us that we don't necessarily want. And we've seen this kind of thing before. And if this is going to happen, it really needs to happen with our blessing. And that means there needs to be a different kind of process with this. And we may decide that we actually don't want it, right? And
Are you
so
talking about like agricultural industries, farmers, ranchers?
Yeah, folks who live in some of those communities. And not only that, but actually in California, farming is not much of an issue for this. Ranching is a very marginal industry here. There's a lot of hand-wringing about wolves and ranching up in the northeast part of California right now, but bears are not nearly as much of a concern there. I think that the issue is more one of identity, actually, and more of a sense that there are some folks in those communities, and for reasons that are quite justifiable, I believe, think that, professors who live in Santa Barbara shouldn't be telling them that they have to live with a brown bear, right? And so I get that. And that's why what our group is doing is not really telling people that this is something we should be doing. We're not really necessarily even arguing for it. But what we're doing is arguing for the discussion about it in a way that could hopefully be kind of enlightening and cause people to think about possibilities that otherwise might seem impossible. So that's really what we're doing.
Okay, I do want to get to audience questions, but I have a few more just to kind of cover the lay of the land. Where specifically you've researched if this is possible, and you're still working on your findings. I think AJ mentioned in his article won't be complete for another 2 years. Ish. But if grizzly bears were to be reintroduced, the article talks about how the grizzly bear in Wyoming is very different from a grizzly bear in Montana, that they've adapted to their geography in very different ways. Which ones would you just pick them up and drop them off in California? And if so, where would that be? Where are the best places now? Because where they used to live are full of Starbucks and me.
So so grizzlies occurred in all 58 California counties in the 19th century. And so the only really area that grizzlies didn't occur in California was the low deserts, right? And probably at least a little bit into the high deserts, although they did live around the fringe, and some of the resources in the high deserts are actually extraordinarily valuable to them, particularly pine nuts from pinyon pine trees. So grizzlies lived all over. Certainly their richest habitats are also the habitats that we have chosen, first indigenous peoples and then later European settlers as the primo areas to build our biggest cities and farms. And so some of those habitats are gone. But I think it is important to recognize what the geography of California actually looks like, because from the Bay Area or LA, it's a pretty skewed vision. So California's got almost 40 million people, but about 75% of them live on about 2% of the land area. And California has more acreage in protected areas than any other US state except Alaska. Now, some of those protected areas, national parks, wilderness, are in the desert. So you need to kind of lop those off, right? But there's actually a lot of potential grizzly habitat out there. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a back of the envelope study about 25 years after they said they were going to do it, that they just came out with about a year ago, that where they set up a methodology that led to the conclusion that there's no more habitat anywhere in the US other than the areas that they've already designated as habitat. And so as soon as they did that, folks who have been following this for a long time kind of looked at it and said, this happens over and over again. It's happened with jaguars in the Southwest too. This is the first part of this conversation. By the way, jaguars lived in California and they could be reintroduced potentially as well. So that's the first part of a conversation. And so what we're doing is we're trying to have a kind of more rigorous and comprehensive methodology to look at that. And so what we've done is we've combined 3 different ways of modeling habitat. We have our results now, but the paper isn't published. And what the results say is that there's a lot of habitat in the northwestern portion of the state, in the Sierra, and potentially also in my backyard in the southwestern corner of the state in the vicinity of the Los Padres National Forest. Okay, so that's the question of potentially where. There have been protocols that have been developed over the years for how to translocate, move animals from place to place that hopefully carry the fewest risks associated with them for the animals and have the greatest chance of allowing them the time and space to be able to get situated in the area, to understand its geography, to know where the resources are, and to survive, right? The greatest danger of a reintroduction is not to people, it is to the animals. Animals often die during reintroductions, and the reason is because they get plopped off somewhere, they start moving in a direction, they end up on a road, and they get hit by a car. That is the most likely scenario of a bad case that you'd want to avoid. So it needs to be in a remote area. It needs to be done slowly. The right animals need to be picked. It needs to happen. The movement needs to happen quickly during the right time of year, et cetera. So there's a whole kind of body of research around that. Where would they come from? Well, it is true that brown bears, so grizzlies are what we call brown bears in most of North America, but the brown bears live, don't forget, North America, Europe, and Asia. It's the same species. They're very closely related to polar bears, so much so that there are now examples of brown bears and polar bears mating and producing fertile offspring in the wild.
Really?
Yep. We could talk about that too if you want. It's a fascinating story.
That's a whole other. I need to see a blend. I need to see a blended polar/brown bear.
You can Google it right now if you want. So maybe in a few minutes. Okay. So the reason for that is that a polar bear is essentially a very specialized version of a brown bear. It's a hyper-carnivore. It eats almost all meat, and it's a marine mammal. Polar bears are considered marine mammals. Brown bears are extremely diverse terrestrial mammals. In most cases, they get the vast majority of their nutrition from plants. Our studies using stable isotopes show that prior to European colonization, brown bears in California were on average about 85% vegetarian. So characterizing them as an apex predator, in some cases, but not in most. So brown bears live in different ways in a lot of different places. They live one way along the salmon rivers of southern Alaska. They live a different way in the Mediterranean-style ecosystems of Spain. And they live a different way in the Gobi Desert in Central Asia. Same species. California has a lot of resources for bears. They just need to be able to remember how to tap them, right? And that is the trick. How quickly will that adaptation occur?
Being the bears.
Yes, when you're bringing them from a different area. Yeah. In general, though, they're extremely flexible species. A polar bear is like a really specific, really sharpened, really fine sushi knife. A brown bear is like a Swiss Army knife. It does a lot of things, none of them perfectly, but it can do a lot of them. And so what we would need to do is we'd need to bring brown bears from areas where their populations are thriving, bring them in very small numbers at first, a couple or a few, put them in an area that is extremely remote and that's intensively monitored, and follow them and see what they do and what happens. So we're talking about, a very slow, very incremental, very small scale initial process as part of a learning process to try to understand how to do this in a way that reduces risks to the bears and of course to people who could be in jeopardy if they hit an animal with their car, right? Keep in mind, now I can see that you're thinking something and you're thinking, I'm more worried about me than the bear.
Yeah.
And so let me just put this into perspective. So in North America, on average, about 1.5 people die per year as a result of some kind of conflict or incident with a bear.
Really?
1.5 people. About 45,000 die in car accidents in the US alone, and another 45,000 in the US alone die as a result of gun-related injuries. So that's just about something like, I forget what the number is, but there are more people who die as a result of vending machines, right, than bears.
Yeah.
So, like you can, just to put that in perspective. The flip side of that is that in the lower 48 US states, brown bears, grizzlies, are fully protected under federal law. But 80% of the bears that die in any given year are killed by people. They're killed in one of a few ways: by cars, by malicious killings.
What does that? What do you mean, like hunters?
No, a malicious killing is someone who says, there's a grizzly bear and I don't like it. I don't like what the government is doing, and I'm going to kill this bear as a way of resistance, basically. Oh. And then the third is mistaken killings. People who are out hunting, they think they're going after a black bear and they accidentally kill a grizzly. So those are the three main sources of mortality for bears in the lower 48 US states. It's not disease or old age or anything like that.
I'm going to start grabbing some audience questions, of which we have many. Carol asks, is it true you can obtain, these are just going to come free flowing at you, Pete. Is it true you can obtain a license to kill a limited number of grizzlies in Montana? And if so, how does this square with the IUCN?
Great question. So it is not true currently that you can hunt grizzlies in Montana, because grizzlies in Montana are still, although there's been a series of back and forth court battles about this over the years, are still listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, which means they are fully protected at the federal level. So you cannot hunt them legally in any of the areas where they occur in the lower 48 US states. Now, that is different in Alaska. In Alaska, the state and federal governments work together to manage bears, and part of the management program is a hunt. The areas are managed differently in different parts of the state for hunting, and there is some difference between resident Alaskans, native Alaskans, and people who go to Alaska from outside. So, for example, hunters from California, some of whom will pay maybe up to $50,000 to travel to Alaska and go on a hunt. And so there is a managed brown bear hunt in Alaska, but not in the lower 48, and that is because they are listed as threatened in the lower 48, but not in Alaska.
We're getting a lot of questions about, and again, I realize 1.5 people a year killed by a bear, but as before we went live, we were talking about the media's representation of bears. Some media, not Alta's, but some media's representation of bears, and our, we've all seen Legends of the Fall. So what should one do? Someone is traveling to Banff and Jasper. What do we do if we run into a grizzly bear? Or if 10, 15, 25 years down the road, grizzlies are reintroduced to California and we happen to encounter one?
That is great. I love this. So you will not be surprised to know that there has been a lot of research dedicated to this topic. A fellow named Stephen Herrero, who I believe is based at the University of Alberta in Calgary, I believe, for years. I did a lot of research on this, looking at gathering data on bear-related incidents and trying to figure out what caused them. And if I can just summarize his research very briefly, a whole career really of research, he found that something like 95% ish of bear quote unquote attacks, okay, that's a loaded word that gets thrown around a lot in the media, but I think really misunderstands what's going on in the animal's brain, but oftentimes, but anyway, that about 95% of these incidents were the result of three things, three clearly identifiable things. One, a bear that had gained access to human food and had become bold, aggressive, and that way was now was food conditioned and predisposed to becoming aggressive toward people. It lost its fear of people, essentially because people had fed it. That's one. Two is a mother with cubs, a sow with cubs, right? That's two. And then three, and this is rarer, but it has happened, is that somebody stumbles upon a bear that is feeding on a carcass. And the bear is either surprised or it's possessive and it reacts. Now, for the first example, it is easy to see how that is a challenging issue, but could be addressed if we really invested in it properly, right? To keep bears away from human food. Bears were getting into people's food all the time in Sequoia Kings Canyon and Yosemite National Parks for years. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, a group of biologists there got some money from Congress, and they went in and they really changed this. And over the course of 10 years, bears basically ceased eating human food, and the number of bear-related conflicts went down by over 90%. They did it there. We can do it in other places. The second case of a mother with cubs, that is a simple one. People in California are spoiled, like me. We go to the High Sierra, we want to pretend we're doing Leave No Trace, we want to be all alone, and we want to go sneaking around, in the woods, pretending that we're out there 200 years ago. If you're hiking in grizzly country, then you should actually do the exact opposite. You should travel in groups, you should make noise, you shouldn't damage the landscape, Leave No Trace still applies, but you should do it in a different way. It causes you to be more social, right? To let these animals know you're coming. If they know you're coming, they will leave. That's what they do. The third case is very similar. You never want to surprise a bear. You don't want to surprise one eating, especially, and you let them know that you're coming. What they will generally do is they will leave the carcass, and then they will come back after you pass through, or you should just go the opposite direction, which is even better. So, I think that what this does is I'm not trying to make light of these situations, because when people get hurt, they really get hurt. What I'm trying to say is that a little education and a little investment in reducing the risk of these things can go a long way. Bears are predictable in general. People aren't. We need to be more predictable to them. And the way that we do that is by not feeding them and letting them know we're coming.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to do 3 more questions and then we're going to let you get back to educating people. There's one person asked a question in here, which I will ask because this is an urban, perhaps a myth that occurred to me at CYO Camp Armstrong. On a nature hike, are bears attracted to the scent of menstruating women? And if you are a person who is menstruating, should you stay out of bear area?
That is 100% a myth. It is actually tested by people in the field, and it is not the case at all. But every myth has a kernel of truth, right? And so what is the kernel of truth there? The kernel of truth is that bears have a sense of smell that by some measures is far stronger than even the best dog, the best hound dog, right? Far stronger. So that means that if you're out, cooking a really stinky, tasty meal in the wild, then you can bet that the bears for, maybe a mile in every direction, assuming that it's a calm day, the wind isn't blowing hard in one direction, are going to smell that. And so that's something to think about when you go into areas with bear country, about how to not, entice these animals into the bad behavior that can come with curiosity, right? Bears have an outstanding sense of smell. They are attracted to a wide variety of smells. They eat almost anything. But one of the things that they are not attracted to is the scent of menstruation. It's been tested in the field. It is an urban myth.
Oh my God, I love this. Once again, women getting blamed for stuff. As C.E. Korngold points out, wow, there really were signs in Canada in the early 70s regarding menstruating women saying, stay away. 70s.
Yep.
Joy asks, regarding the polar bear brown bear union, again, we like the weird stuff. Has that occurred because of climate change, whereby the starving polar bears are moving south for food, and compatibility of it with the brown bear is creating this new, I guess it's a subspecies?
Okay, so that is a rabbit hole that we could spend an entire session on. I love this conversation. I'm having so much fun. Okay, so a couple things. One, yes, it does seem more likely that brown bears and polar bears are coming together more often now, in part as a result of climate change. That is being caused by a couple things. One is that polar bears, as sea ice melts earlier in the season, they're being forced more onto land and foraging on land. That is not a good situation for them because they can get into conflicts, and also because their diets are so high calorie in the ocean that there's almost no amount of foraging on land that seems like it can make up for it. Okay, so their metabolism is very different. Meanwhile, brown bears are moving further north, also because of climate change, so they're coming together more often. Now, it turns out, and we know this actually from mitochondrial DNA studies, that if a male polar bear and a female brown bear or a male brown bear come together in the wild, then the male polar bear will probably kill and eat it.
The female brown bear.
Either. If a female polar bear comes into contact with a male brown bear, they may mate. So a male polar bear will not mate with a brown bear, but a female polar bear might.
Well, maybe.
Might. Okay, and we know that because we've been able to trace that through mitochondrial DNA. Okay, so what that means is that there may be more of these in the future. They're hybrids, they're not subspecies. And we also know, because they're not likely to form new lines, we also know that this has happened a lot in the past, that certain groups of polar bears, particularly polar bears in southern Alaska and the islands near Juneau, were isolated during the height of the last ice age, and there was significant mating with polar bears in that area at that time. So we know that from Paleo-DNA studies, which are fascinating. And then I think another thing to remember about this is that some folks have said, oh, well, hybrids could be good because they could help animals adapt or adjust to climate change. Well, that's possible. But it turns out that when you mate a polar bear with a grizzly bear, what you get is an animal that's not great on the ocean and not great on the land. You don't get the best of all worlds. You get a mishmash, which is not as well adapted to either of the lifestyles that those animals generally live. So it's possible that being a generalist and not being particularly good at anything could help you in a time of climate change. That is possible. But it is unlikely for a bunch of different ecological and genetic reasons. And it's also unlikely that there will be enough hybrids to really make a significant difference in the population over the long period of time. Keep in mind that there are a small number of polar bears in the world and a large number of brown bears. So the polar bear is like a drop in the brown bear bucket. And so the interaction between the two species is complex. It's been happening over a long period of time, and it is changing right now as a result of climate change.
Okay, could we not, folks, talk about this forever and how cool is Professor Pete? Okay, last question for you. I'm not going to get, it is not for us to figure out today, should brown bears, if you and your team are currently trying to figure out if it's possible to reintroduce brown bears to California, and if so, how that would happen, where they would go, what the process would be, etc. I'm not even going to ask you who's going to pay for this if we decide to do it. What I do want to ask you is to pull out your psychic crystal ball and tell us if you think it's going to happen. One way or another, will, in our lifetimes, say we've all got 50 years left, will the grizzly bear be reintroduced to California?
I think so.
Twist. Exciting.
It is a twist. It is a twist. And I'll tell you one thing that makes me think that it is possible. And that is the fact that over the last 10 years, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has gone from classifying beavers, which, by the way, are harder to live with than bears in many cases, right? They can be great for adjusting to climate change. They can be great for managing fire. They can be great for recharging watersheds, but they're a real pain in the butt if they flood your field, right? Or your yard. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife has gone from listing beavers as a non-native nuisance species to last year in Governor Newsom's budget, including a line item for five new full-time positions to facilitate beaver reintroduction and recovery in California as a climate change resilience measure, in part, an ecosystem restoration measure. I think that we are very slowly starting to turn the corner in California of making a commitment, seeing the damage that's being wrought by climate change and making a commitment to heal, regenerate ecosystems, and reconnect people with them. And I think that reestablishing our entire suite of native species has got to be at the core of that mission. So you can look for grizzlies, you can look for jaguars in California, maybe.
Right, you totally dropped the Jaguar thing on us. I was like, well, we'll do another article on the Jaguars. We could also reintroduce Jaguars to California, apparently. Well,
there are enough wild pigs out there to feed them. I can tell you that.
Oh, we did wild pigs. I think we did last issue or 2 issues ago. Yes. This has been so fun and so eye-opening. I can tell that you're such a great teacher just because it would be fun to be your student. You have such a passion for this, and it's really fun to speak with you and get to ask these kind of casual, fun, interesting questions and experience your passion for it, because it's absolutely contagious. So thank you so much. Professor Pete, for joining us today. Thanks to AJ for this amazing article. And we'll send you all a link to that, as well as a link to this interview where you can buy Pete's book, and a link to join us next week. We are welcoming Pulitzer Prize winning author Jane Smiley to be in conversation with our editorial director, Blaise Zariga. So do join us for that. Again, Pete, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Beth.
Take care, everyone. Bye.